Good. Thank you for those that presented themselves. I see we have Martin from Amsterdam, drinks producer, always looking for investors. That's great. But we'll teach you here how to bootstrap regardless of investors. So hopefully that would make sense. We have Sophie from Porto. Really cool. Wine and spirits. Maybe you should connect with Martin. Probably you know each other, but maybe not. So, send them as you should guys maybe chat on a private. Good. We see also with Mozam from Pakistan, who is doing an AI-based health tech ecosystem. Really cool. Moti from Israel, a weather forecast solution. Really cool. So we have some very high quality tech startups. We have wine startups, drink startups. So that's really fun to see. Good. I think we're ready to go. So thank you for arriving today. Today we're going to speak more than anything about bootstrapping, bootstrapping your startup. Feel free to, in the middle, if you have any questions, something you want to ask, send it to me either on the chat or on the QA, and I will do my best to get to it as soon as possible. So that's sort of like the idea. Share my screen for a second, just a minute to get started. And if anyone didn't introduce themselves, please feel free to. You can still do that. I'm hoping that the connections are going to be just as valuable as the conversation. So let me quickly share screen, just a minute. Okay. So basically, today we'll be speaking about bootstrapping a startup. And okay. So, but before that, let me just tell you, we have a new cooperation with IBM, IBM for startups. It's very interesting what's happening in the world. Many corporates are currently trying to connect with startups. They know that innovation is with startups. What IBM is offering is quite interesting. They're offering this for startup software developers, startup network, accelerators, and so on and so on. Basically, they give you a no cost, equity free program, access to mentors, access to their IBM AI solutions like Watson. I don't know if you know, but they were the first one that started it. Whoever knows history with Watson, that also played really good chess. So they give you mentors, they give you access to credits on Watson, which is extremely advanced AI tool for the AI guys here. I know that we have two of them, potential partners and clients. So it's a real win, no equity, free of charge. I'm going to make sure that someone writes the link in the chat, but it's at ibm.startuplink.com. Easy to remember and totally recommended. One of the things that we do as startups is keep on finding those opportunities. So that's our goal is to keep on finding opportunities to associate ourselves with high quality companies and to get free stuff, freebies always to whatever we're developing. So try it out. Today, we're going to speak a little bit about bootstrapping your startup. Um, Martin asked, no, this is IBM. They don't care where you are. Everyone is, they accept everyone. So basically, as long as you fill in the application, it doesn't matter where you're from. So feel free to click the link and apply. Cool. Bootstrapping your startup. My name is Eli David Rokach. I'm the CEO of StartupBlink. My email is eli@startuplink.com. If you have any questions after, want to connect, that's great. I'll start with maybe telling you a little bit about what we do. So that's the idea, and then we can go to other stuff. So first of all, the topics for today are intro and update, a little bit about what are the things that we're doing. Then deciding if your startup is relevant to be a bootstrapping startup, or are you going to go for investments? And then the strategy and the tactics of bootstrapping. So that's going to be a little bit our agenda. A little bit about what StartupLink is doing. We have a global startup ecosystem map, 200,000 startups on one giant map. One thing that we're going to talk about again, the bootstrapping element. We always want to get as much traction as possible for free. There are many directories in the world of startups that allow you to get some SEO juice. Startup Link is one of them. One of the interesting things is if you add your startup to Startup Link for free, you can also see your rankings in your city, in your country, in your industry, and so on. So startuplink.com/startups takes you to this massive map. And it's always good to also use it to kind of figure out who is your competition, who is doing things that are similar for you. We're all getting busy very, very fast, but then again, it makes sense to a little bit get a feeling for our industry as well. So it's a very interesting tool. We are powered, by the way, by SEMrush and Crunchbase, among others. So it's an initiative that has a lot of partners. Generally, one of the things that we do is also we release every year a report, once again, a free report that ranks the startup ecosystems of 1,000 cities and 100 countries. We'll speak a little bit about why is it important to all of us to be in the right place. This report is being done with more than 100 governments. The next report, by the way, ranking all those cities and countries, is going to be out next month. If you want to download the report, and I'll tell you a little bit about why our ecosystem matters so much, it's at report.startuplink.com. And if any of you, by chance, is an startup ecosystem developer from either government or private sector organizations, send us an email at feedback@startuplink.com, and we'll see how we can add you to those partners. So the first slide of bootstrapping, before we start talking about bootstrapping, is basically choose your ecosystem wisely. I don't know if does any of you know Naval Ravikant. I really recommend to follow him on Twitter and to figure out basically the guy has a lot of very interesting insights about startups. Naval says that there are big three big questions in life. One of them is what are we working on? Which I know that all of us are thinking a lot about what is it that we're working on and how can we make it better. The second one is who are we working with? Who is our co-founder, our partner, and so on. And the third big question of Naval is where we are. Where do we choose to stay? And the idea over here is that both unicorns or successful self-funded startups, they're usually going to be in winner places. Martin, you mentioned Amsterdam, that if I'm not mistaken, is probably 27 in the world. So you're in a very good ecosystem. Moti, I know that you're from Israel. You have Tel Aviv at number 10. What happens in the good startup ecosystems is that, for lack of better word, good things are happening there. Good surprises out of nowhere. When I speak with successful startups, and in those locations, and I usually ask them, look, what was the moment that was the critical moment of your startup? Many of those moments are random, unplanned. It's a person that you met on a meetup that connects you to another person, and that's how you got your first client, your first investor, and so on. So I would just encourage you to think about the topic about, am I currently in the best place I can be in order to achieve my goal? There is a reason why a lot of entrepreneurs are going specifically for San Francisco and those locations. Simply in great ecosystems, good things are happening out of chat. There is a reason why also in the top 20 cities in the world, there are about 80% of the unicorns. And by the way, those top 20 cities don't have a double-digit number of population, global population. They're relatively low on population when you compare it to the total population of the planet, but they have a vast majority of unicorns. It's not because people are smarter there, it's just because when a lot of people are working on high quality projects and they do it in one city or a few cities, that city has a major, major advantage. So sometimes it makes sense to make sure that we are in one of those cities. I am not saying that all of us has to aspire to become to go to one of those 25 cities, but there are more than 10,000 cities in the world. We rank about 1,000. I think it's a valuable exercise for all of us to have a look at the list. By the way, it's also on startupblink.com. You can see the entire list of the 1,000 cities open and ask ourselves, can we improve a little bit our location? Am I really in the best place I can be in, depending on my life expectations, what I want to do in life, where I want to live, and so on and so on. What happens in good quality startup ecosystems, and it's regardless if you're looking for investors, it's critical, by the way, if you're looking for investors, the more you upgrade your startup ecosystem, the better. But even if you're bootstrapping a startup, good things are happening also for bootstrappers in those cities. Those cities are giving you access to investors, high quality clients, co-founders, team members, suppliers, knowledge base. They also give you emotional support. It's really hard to build a startup. So if you choose one of those cities, basically your chances of success are higher. And I don't think we think about this too much. We think a lot about what are we building, not enough about where we are. The conclusion that we have in Startup Link is that usually, depending on your goals, if you are in an underperforming startup ecosystem, you have two options, either leaving it and going to a better ecosystem or leading it, which means creating meetups, becoming the networker, and so on. But you don't want to be a passive player in a low quality ecosystem. And again, there are many, many good ecosystems in the world. There are 1,000 that are even ranked and reach the threshold. If you can improve a little bit, great. And if you can, lead your ecosystem, it always helps. Now, let's talk a little bit about the concept of bootstrapping. Once again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm going to try to check every 2 or 3 slides to see if we have something. So the concept of bootstrapping is basically uh, pulling yourself by the boot, or in another words, self-funding without investment until you reach. Um, and the idea is, how do you actually do that? Yeah. So as for the product market fit, what you need to do is the following. First of all, you're gonna have to invest initially your time. And I see that I have a little bit of audio issues, so I'm gonna try to change a network. Thank you, CJ, for letting me know. So hopefully it will stand until I change. So basically, the idea is, how do you reach product market fit? So the idea would be, more than anything, uh, initial investment of your own time and money. There is no real way around it. So unfortunately for all of us, if you don't have an investor, you are the first investor. And that's something that is that took takes a little bit of time to understand. But we should be the first investors of our startup. By the way, it might disconnect, but hopefully the second network is going to be better. So the idea is, first of all, we invest our own time and money. And then the second element would be reaching profitability as soon as possible by running to the market, again, product market fit, while keeping our expenses to the minimum. So those two bullets basically tell you what is the path if you don't have investors. And it's basically the equation of, make sure I have more revenue, decrease my expenses. This is basically, in the grand scheme of things, the only thing that you can really do in a way. Now, the beauty of bootstrapping is that if you actually pull it off, you remain in full control of your equity, of your company, which creates a lot more freedom for you as an entrepreneur. We're going to speak a little bit about this later. So, now, one thing to think about is basically, should I go for investment or should I go versus self-funding? So I think this is a decision that we cannot avoid thinking about. Because if we're in a situation that we're saying, I'm bootstrapping, but I'm also going to investors and so on, it really affects our strategy. So the idea is really to know what is it that we need to do. Your startup is already uncertain. Make sure that you have a clear strategy in terms of, what do you need to happen? Can you pull it off on your own, or do you need investors? And according to that, the two ways that you're going to do it are totally different. Because if you're going for investors, most of your time is spent on getting investors. If you're going on bootstrapping, most of your time is spent on your client and on your product. Personally, I really prefer the bootstrapping element, but sometimes it's impossible. So the question is, first of all, to ask yourself, can I do it on my own? Do I need investors or can I do it on my own? So those are a few questions that would help you to understand if this is something that you can do on your own. The first question that you want to ask is, am I trying to build a cash flow operation in a specific niche, or am I trying to build a startup that has a much larger scope? The larger your scope is, in terms of geographies and industries and so on, the more likely it is that you're going to need investors. The second question is there a clear, validated business model and direct competitors who make money? So the question is over here is someone making money from what you want to sell? If someone is making money, it's a good sign that maybe you can pull it off with bootstrapping. If this is the first time that someone is trying to do something that you're trying to do, it's much more likely that you're going to need investors. The reason is that if you're trying to do something totally new, you have to discover if there is a pain. You have to constantly pivot between a few parameters in your business, usually the persona that you're targeting, the problem that you're trying to solve, and to keep on upgrading your product or changing your product. Pivoting takes a lot of expenses and delayed revenue. That's why the more, let's say, disruptive your idea, the more probably you're going to gear towards needing investors. Is there a clear pain that you're solving? You can say that startups are dividing into two. One is an aspirin and one is a vitamin. If you're not sure if you're an aspirin, you're very likely to be a vitamin. Vitamins usually don't survive. So if you're a vitamin, it means that there isn't a clear pain that people are really like saying, please, someone solve this. We want to pay right now for the pain to go away. So if you're not in a situation that you can tell yourself honestly, I'm solving a real pain, you might need investors because it's going to take time to find the pain and to validate it as well. Another question would be, can you start selling something right now? Right now. If you can start selling something right now, you're more likely to be bootstrapping it. If your answer is, yeah, but I need at least 5 months to roll the project and da 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 da, it's great. It's okay. But it means that probably you should go for investors. The further you are for the market, the more probably you need to go for investors. And another very important question is, do you have the skills to do most of the work yourself, either with yourself or with your co-founders? So if, for example, you tell me, I need to build a very complex AI algorithm, and in order to do that, I need a few people in the US to develop the product, very likely that you need investors. If you're saying, no, I have all the coding skills to basically build the application, the MVP, and so on, you might be able to pull it off on your own. By the way, it connects a little bit to the persona of the bootstrapper. I wish I was this persona. The persona of this bootstrapper is usually someone that can code. Um, if you don't have a coder in your team, very likely that you're going to need an investor. Spoiler alert, investors are also not going to be happy if you don't have a coder in your team that is a co-founder, because then they're afraid that the code is going to be fragile. So that's the idea. But those are a few questions to basically help you a little bit to understand um, if you should focus your time as as a founder on getting investors, or you can actually pull it off in bootstrapping. I think it takes time to take a deep breath and figure out what is it that we want to do. Okay, so that's sort of like the idea. And unfortunately, sometimes if you're not close to the market, investors are simply must. That's the sad reality of it. Um, okay, good. So move to the next slide. So the next slide basically tells us that actually some people have pulled it off without basically taking investors. You have companies like GitHub, Mailchimp, 37 Signals, TechCrunch. All of them raised money in advanced stage. They didn't raise money in the beginning. They basically built something that made a lot of money, and then investor came to them and told them, please basically let us in on your company as well. Now, if this is happening, what's happening is basically if this thing is happening, that you get money in a much, much better valuation and without all the clauses that investors are putting to basically take control of your company in some capacity. It can happen when you're the weaker side. So many of those companies prove to us that it makes sense to, if we can, to delay the search for investors and to get as many milestones under our belt, let's say, because it's going to be much easier to have those conversations. The valuations are going to be much higher as well. And then again, there are many, many startups that have never raised money, conquer the niche, and generate great income for their owners. So that's also, there are tens of thousands of those startups around the world that are making millions of dollars. They never raised money as well. They're never in the news also. Those are not the startups that the news is talking about. So, so it's something to take into account. Now, there is a reason of why bootstrapping is becoming very popular. Um, Launching a startup now is much less expensive than ever. You know, we have Dropbox, Skype, plugins. To start a startup 30, 40 years ago required that you have servers, you do international calls, you hire everyone in-house in your country and so on. The world has become very easy to build a startup in a relatively cheap, affordable way. And that's something that was unheard of 40 years ago. 40 years ago, if someone wanted to build a startup, they would first of all find investors. Today, it's really not the case. There is also methodologies today that help us build a startup and to reach a successful startup in an easier way. Some of them have to do with the MVP methodology, minimum viable product, which basically means let me launch something very basic to the world, see if anyone is interested, and then continue. And if not, maybe even kill the project very early and go to my next project in a way. And I also think that raising money has disadvantages. I'll give you some stories in the next slide about why maybe you don't necessarily want to raise money if you can avoid it. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about why maybe it doesn't make that much sense to raise money, or what are the disadvantages of investors. So first of all, raising money is a full-time job. It gets you out of focus. You're no longer focused on your product. You're no longer focused on your clients. Send many, many emails, trying to get meeting after meeting. That's basically the idea. Unfortunately, that's the reality of startups, of raising investment. Some of those meetings, the investors are even not gonna arrive. You know, I've been there. It's a very, very draining period. The period of raising investment is very draining. It's also emotionally problematic, like it gets you down. So if you can avoid it and focus on your product and your client, maybe it makes sense. Now, chances are also against you. Not surprisingly, there are more people in the world that are interested in um, uh, receiving money than giving money. So by definition, chances are a little bit against you, especially if you don't know the right people. So if you don't know the right people, it can be a little bit of an issue, and that's a recommendation to all of you that are basically trying to get investors. Um, if you don't know the investors in advance, it doesn't make that much sense to run after them when you need them. So just a quick note, although this is not an investor presentation, try to build connection with investors 1 or 2 years before you're going to ask them for money. That's basically part of building your network that makes a lot of sense. If you have investors, you're no longer your own boss. If you don't have investors, you can decide to do whatever you want with your company. You can move it around, you can change it, you can decide that you take 2 months of vacation and so on. when you do have investors, there is a lot of reporting, there is decision making. There are quite a few disadvantages of having other people that have equity in your company. Even if they have 10%, you still have a moral obligation to them, and you have to take this into account. Now, investors might also not be fun to deal with. You have a new partner, the new partner has their opinions, they will voice their opinions, and in many cases, it would be opinions that don't make a lot of sense. So take it into account. It's just like you bring a new partner into your personal life. In a way, over here, an investor sort of resembles a co-founder, someone that is going to be there and is going to also influence your happiness. In some cases, you can get fired. There are many, many VCs, for example, that have a clause that just like even successful startups like Uber fired their CEO, there are many, many cases in which a VC, a venture capital, can fire the CEO. Another element here is that investors will always push you towards liquidity. They always want you to build something massive to pay back their fund. And if, let's say, if you're happy and you're making $100,000 of profit and you want to stop, and you basically tell them, look, I'm interested, like I have $100,000 of profit every month. I'm super happy. Let me give you a dividend. They will basically tell you, no, no, you took our money. uh, we were betting on you to become a unicorn or something massive to return all our other failed investment. The bottom line is that you can't stop. When you have investors, you go to the end and you go big. This is the only way for them also to get back return on investment. And we had bubble years in startups, and those bubble years also showed us that too much money is sometimes distracting. It allows you to build years. Let's say if someone gives you $1 million to build something, sometimes they're doing you a disservice because you're going to spend the next 4 years in doing something that nobody needs. It's much better to spend half a year and figure out on your own that nobody needs it because you're out of money and you're going to close after half a year, than working on other people's money for 4 years, just figuring out after the 4 years that actually nobody really needs your product or it doesn't really have a good business model. So investors can be distracting. They can actually take some of your time, even if you're successful. And as we mentioned before, if you manage to get investors later on, the valuation is going to be much higher. So it might make a little bit of sense um, to delay it as much as you can. Now, I'll tell you something that also not having investors and bootstrapping gives you opportunities on lifestyle. I've been traveling the world in the last 14 years. I've been living in more than 80 countries. That's why I have bad internet. I'm now in Mexico. And the idea is that by not having investors and doing it on your own, you have full control on your lifestyle as well. By the way, if anyone is interested in the digital nomad lifestyle, I have a blog at becomenomad.com. It's a blog and a podcast. So you can learn more about how to pull it off, building a startup while being on the road. But again, if you have investors, this thing is becoming extremely difficult. The serious investors would expect you to live exactly the life of a template founder, which is for very good reason, by the way, because you're much more focused and you pick a good ecosystem and they have better chances of success. Now, in case we have decided to bootstrap our startup, then there is a thing called the subsidy model. The subsidy model basically means that the following. Startups are very, very difficult to make money from. Most of them are not going to be profitable in the first few years. So you need to be in a situation that you always have a layer that brings you money to sustain and subsidize your startup. Your startup is going to lose money. I can give you almost a guarantee that in the first 1,000 days of your startup, that's a model that was developed by the TMBA podcast. In the first 1,000 days of your startup, you're very likely to lose money. So that means that something has to fund it. In my case, what funded StartupBlink was initial savings and doing freelancing. So many people will tell you, no, you have to focus 100% on your startup and so on. That's not necessarily the case. The case is that you have to find a way to subsidize your startup as well, either with savings or with a daily job or whatever in order to make sure that your startup doesn't die in the beginning. The startup is not going to be the answer for your cash flow problem. Now, some sources for bootstrapping I'll share with you is basically you can fund it from your own savings. In many cases, building a startup is sometimes a privileged thing. People that like it's more likely that you will be able to build a startup if you're going for a startup, not a business. A business is great for absolutely everyone to become an entrepreneur. A startup, which basically means that you're building something that has massive uncertainty in the business model in demand, usually you would need to arrive with a little bit of money to it. But that's important that we share this. So some elements over here is you have to fund your startup from your savings. You can get a loan. We're going to talk a little bit about getting a loan, so to make sure that we're not making mistakes here. Um, you can get a grant. You can use crowdfunding. You can join an accelerator, and you can start 1,000 days to arrive through profitability. Now, this slide is telling us a little bit about what are the ways that people are actually funding their startup. What are the most popular ways of funding your startup? And I know that a lot of us have heard a lot about VCs and investors and angel investors and so on, but this chart actually tells you that this is not really the case. You can see that both angel investors and venture capital are relatively low. What is very, very popular on funding a startup is people's personal savings and taking credit from the banks and friends and family. So those are the most common ways of funding a startup. Again, those ways are not in the news, but that's usually how people are doing that. We'll talk a little bit about loans in a second. I just want to tell you something about the family and friends. The family and friends, the people that are investing in your startup, getting a little bit of equity and so on. Some people call it family, friends, and fools in a way. And the idea over here is that I'm a big, let's say, I used to be very much against it. I thought it was really stupid to take money from family and friends. Today, I understand that in many cases, it's unavoidable. The people that know us the most and that trust us the most are our family and friends. So it makes sense at some capacity to go for raising money from them. I'll just give you a word of advice about what you should do if you do that. The first thing you should do is to tell them, look, I'm 100% I'm going to be successful, but you should know that 90% of startups in the world fail. Okay? That's a good statistic to share with them. They should know. And it's your responsibility to tell them as well. And the second thing that I recommend is if you take money from family and friends, make sure that you don't take a big enough amount that would really influence their quality of life if you can't return the money to them. If you don't do it, you're going to have very awkward conversations in the dinner table. So try to think about this as well. Or if your uncle only has $100,000 in the bank account and wants to give you $80,000, don't take it. If they have $1 million in the bank account, then you can consider taking it. Okay, so this is something to take into account. Now let's talk a little bit about self-funding. Self-funding is basically us putting our own money in our startup. And I think it's a good idea to an extent. The idea over here is that if you believe in your startup, it's a good idea to put a little bit of your savings in your startup in the beginning. The reasons are that it creates self-commitment. You're not going to back out on the first sign of a challenge. It signals also your commitment to co-founders and investors. Many investors, if you arrive to an investor and you tell them, look, I need $5,000 to build a website, they will always tell you the same. They will tell you, why didn't you invest $5,000 of your own money? Like, don't you believe in your startup to even put 5K? So I do recommend for all of us as an exercise, let's try to put $5,000 in our startup. When we start, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And of course, it allows you to start right away. You don't have to wait for someone to give you permission to start or to give you money to start. But again, if you do that, make sure that you're not putting all your savings. You're putting a small part, hopefully, of your savings. Now, another way of basically bootstrapping your startup is while you're building your startup, uh, get money from another source. Some jobs allow you to do that. I know some people that are night guards, basically. They go to their shift as a night guard and just get a salary while coding their first startup into reality. You can also do consulting. Let's say you have an expertise, you're building a startup, and you're saying to yourself, 3 or 2 hours a day, I'm dedicating to consulting. And you can also do freelancing. Those are some of the recommended most big global networks of for doing freelancing. You have TopTal, you have Upwork, you have Fiverr. There are quite a few of them. This is especially relevant if you live in a low-cost location that has low cost, and then you can also get clients from high-cost locations like the USA or North Europe and so on. So those are some ways to think about this. The other way to consider is to take loans and credit. So over here, a word of warning: you have to be very, very cautious from taking a loan. Sometimes they're needed, but try to avoid loans or burning your savings if there is a substantial uncertainty about demand or the business model and so on, and you don't know if people really need it, but you're not sure, and people are starting to buy, but you're not sure it's going to be profitable. I would also be careful. Basically, loans are only here when you have a validated business model that has a pain, you know that you solve the pain, and you know you can solve the pain in a profitable way. Only then you can take a little bit of line of credit because you have things under your control. You know there is a pain because you sell, and you know that the sales are actually generating profit. So in this case, maybe I would consider a loan. And the same advice that I gave you for friends and family, if you are taking a loan, make sure that it's in a sum that if you lose the sum, and you're likely to lose the sum, it's not going to heavily influence your quality of life, right? And the last advice about loans is to cap your loss. That means basically that you should decide in advance what is the border of the loan. Because it's very, very tempting to take more loan on top of loans and so on. Decide that, let's say, you're not taking more than $15,000 of loan from the bank, and whatever happens, you're not extending it further because loans, just like gambling, can get addictive, and you don't want to be there. So that's sort of like a little bit of a thing to think about. Okay, a little bit about grants. So grants are usually given by the government. For example, you have government stuff like Startup Chile that give you $40,000 and then many, many other government grants that exist. But they're also offered by corporations, by universities, and also by non-profit organizations. The good thing about grants, usually they don't take your equity. The problematic things about grants is that they take a very long time to find. They take even more time to apply to. You're becoming a bureaucrat filling forms. And some grants also put some limitation of you that you can only hire in one place and you can only do X, Y, Z. Sometimes investors are not big fans of having those limitations. So just use them if you can. They're absolutely amazing. Some of them are beautiful, but be careful of not going into a grant that would cause you damage, one. And two, make sure that grants are not becoming your business model. Your only real business model is your client and your sales. Always, always remember this with your real business model, and it has to be the client. Now, a little bit about accelerators. Usually, those are programs of 1 to 3 months. They give you mentors. Some give you even money for a little bit of equity. The problem is that the best accelerators in the world, like Y Combinator, that I really, really recommend to check if you have massive aspirations. They're by far the best. They're looking for unicorns, not for bootstrap businesses. So some of them will only accept you if you have a market potential of arriving to a massive, massive valuation of a unicorn or $100 million and so on and so on. So take it into account. The accelerators are really good if you feel like you need a little bit more education. They're basically offering you sort of a mini MBA. They're good for connection to investors. Some of them are not. And that's the idea. The recommendation is basically some accelerator really suck, some accelerator are absolutely amazing. You have to check, do some due diligence, make sure that the mentors there are really impressive people. Try to ask people that attended the accelerator, how was it for them? So that's a little bit the idea over here in terms of the accelerator. There are some online accelerator. We talked a little bit about them. IBM for startups is one of them. There are many opportunities out there from corporates as well. Check them out. A little bit about crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is basically putting your startup on a page and getting money from the public by creating a viral campaign. Um, some advantages to this, usually you don't give equity on crowdfunding platforms, although some of them do. You don't really need a business plan, due diligence, going to investor meetings, and so on. It does make you think a lot about what you build because you have to put it on a landing page and really convince people. It's a beautiful exercise. Many people that start a crowdfunding campaign, they realize when they actually build it that they don't really understand their own product. So it's a fun exercise. And it allows you to test basically if there is demand before you build something. So one of the biggest problems that we have as founders is that we never know if we're really solving a big pain, a real pain. So by putting something on a crowdfunding platform, before you actually build it, you can see if people are interested. It's a beautiful business intelligence element. And if it works, it gives you some cash in advance before you build. You usually say, look, I'm going to ship my hardware and IoT device to you, but first of all, you get the money. So it's pretty interesting. But there are some disadvantages as well. By the way, Kickstarter is a big crowdfunding platform, Indiegogo, and there are quite a few others as well. Some disadvantages in crowdfunding, it takes money to prepare campaigns. It's not that easy. You basically have to invest so much in marketing. You have to get the traffic to your own page. They're not going to send you traffic. Many people think they are. No, the traffic is on you. Most startups are not feasible for crowdfunding. Usually it's for hardware or physical product that is more relevant. And you can easily get the pricing wrong. Then you sold, let's say, 1,000 units of something that only when you start to manufacture it, you understand it was much more expensive than what you thought it would be. So be careful when you do crowdfunding. Okay, other tips that are recommended. One of them would be to reduce your life cost. So the idea over here is that, as we mentioned before, um, you as a bootstrapper, you have to do two things: make more money and try to save as much money as possible. Every dollar you save is a dollar that adds up to your profit. So some of the recommendations over here is go live somewhere cheap that is also a startup hub. Don't go to a village in the middle of nowhere in the mountains because it's going to be extremely lonely to build a startup without a startup environment. But there are many places in the world that you can actually build a startup in very low costs, extremely low cost, and still enjoy a great startup community around you. One of them that comes to mind is Chiang Mai in Thailand, a digital nomad hub, and also Medellin in Colombia. So there are many opportunities in the world to really reduce your cost of living while still being in a hub with a lot of startup people around you. Um, and one other thing would be to maybe say bye to our ego, and basically say, look, if I'm in the startup period currently, I know that it's gonna be difficult financially, and that means that I give up on a lot of things like going out to restaurants and stuff in this period because the startup is gonna suck a lot of the money, and that's okay. It's something that we have. Another innovation. If you're doing, try to innovate and build accounting solutions or bookkeeping solutions or CRM, focus on what your innovation is all about and use other solutions for everything else. Also recommended to use freelancing platforms to hire. There are many, many, especially if you're in a very high cost location like the USA, Norway, Scandinavia, use the freelancing platform to hire talent. There are many people in South America, in Africa, in East Europe that are extremely talented and can do the work for you. Another thing is delay forming legal entity. Many people are so obsessed about, oh, I need an accountant, I need XYZ. Before you have revenue, first of all, try to see if there is demand in the market, then build an entity and make sure that you clear all the problems. But the idea is, in the beginning, you're just here to test if someone is interested. And one more advice would be to work Pareto. You cannot be a perfectionist when you build a startup. You basically you put the time on the 20% that gives you 80% of the value. There is always this principle in absolutely everything that we do in life. And make sure that you're working focused on the 20% that give you 80% and try to disconnect from the other 80% that give you the other 20%. You don't have to be a perfectionist from day one. There is a sentence, you're here to cross the swamp, not fight all the alligators. A few other recommendations that might come to mind is try, if you're bootstrapping, try to make sure that you bootstrap something that sells already. You don't want to be the first person in the world selling something while bootstrapping. It's going to be extremely unlikely to be successful. So you see what works, you tweak it a little bit, you change it a little bit, and then you sell it. And then you know that at least you're selling something that has demand. MVP approach. Don't be a perfectionist that want to have a full, complete product on launch. You launch something that is very, very basic and you see if people are interested. When you launch something, the goal is not to sell. The goal is to figure out if there is actually a real pain. So you launch something basic and you see if people are complaining. Why don't you have this, but I need this for this, and you don't have this feature? This is a beautiful result. You're extremely lucky if this happens. In most cases, when you launch something, nobody cares. That's the problem. So the idea is don't build a complete solution and then discover that nobody cares. Build something basic, give it to the world, see if someone is complaining. That's the best case scenario. If someone is complaining, other methods are to try to sell in advance before you validate the demand. Crowdfunding is one way of doing that. Some people are even putting a landing page and seeing if people are willing to pay and then refund them immediately as an exercise. I never had the courage to do it. Some people are doing it because they say, look, I'm selling you this for $10. When I have a sale, I'm sending you a refund even with a gift of $12 and saying, sorry, the product is not ready yet. But the idea is that we should be obsessed about validating if there is demand and if there is a pain. We should not be obsessed about selling in the beginning. In the beginning, we just need to figure out if we're solving a real pain. Other things that might be helpful is to combine what you do with consulting. So remember the question that I've asked ourselves, can I start selling right now? So sometimes your product is not ready. You have to still add thousands of lines of code and so on, but maybe you can do something that has to do with consulting, sort of like a hybrid, a product that is connected to your product that you can give by consulting or manually, and that would give you the cash, and it would also connect you better with the clients. You would build it manually in the beginning, and then you know what you need to automate in the future. So that's the idea. A little bit about soft skills and recommendations. Basically, if you're doing something B2B, business to business, you need to say yes to almost every opportunity that you get. It will be fine. Don't be shy, hustle, be creative. When you build a startup, basically, there is so much noise in the world that you have to get it out there. You have to be very extrovert about it. Even if you're an introvert, challenge yourself. Find a story that is interesting that would also allow you to get some press, stuff like that. and keep going because startups take a very long time to basically be successful. It's a balance, and sometimes there is a book called The Deep by Seth Godin that takes about sometimes you just have to jump into the swimming pool and dive, knowing that at some point you're gonna go up. So it's not that you can give up on the first challenge. There is absolutely not even one startup in the world, including the most successful ones in the world, that have managed to pull it off without basically have a lot of challenges and difficult periods. You need persistence. We'll speak later about sometimes that too much persistence is not good, but that's the idea. Now, in terms of you and who you choose for the business to become your co-founder, you're the first member. Make sure that whatever your startup does, it aligns with your core skills. Because if you're a musician and you're building a mathematics startup, not so good. Find a co-founder that you trust and have a past experience with. Many of those relationships end in disasters. So the more time you have with the person, there always going to be friction, but at least um, even with the friction, you know that it's a person that you truly trust and enjoy spending time with. It makes all the difference with someone that can do things that you can't do. Okay. So we always have this tendency to find a co-founder is exactly like us. If I'm good in marketing, I want to find someone that does marketing as well because they're my friend and I understand them. No, no. We need to find people that are doing things that we can't do. Okay, so that's important. And another thing would be to put time into writing a good partnership agreement. Have it written, because if it's not written, later it creates a lot of problems. There is a saying in Italian that basically says clear agreement, good friendship. If you value the friendship you have with your co-founder, have an agreement because this agreement will save your friendship. If you leave it open to opinions, you are very likely to ruin your friendship as well. Don't work alone. You need a high quality network. So pick the right ecosystem that has high quality startup founders that you can hang around with, get ideas from, go to events, build your local network of potential co-founders, team members, also investors. You need to speak with them in advance. Don't shut yourself from external feedback. Don't build something on stealth mode. You need to be the evangelist of your startup. Again, there are so many solutions out there. The idea doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is execution. You're going to execute well when you have a lot of people that want to support you. If you stay secret about your startup, it's not going to happen. And try to surround yourself with fellow entrepreneurs, go to co-working spaces and so on, because if you do it alone from home, it can get very challenging. This is the last slide about basically how to kill your startup when it's time. So a lot of our startups are basically zombies. Zombies are basically people that are dead but don't even know that they're dead. And unfortunately, in the startup world, many of our startups are zombies. It's totally okay. Some people say that all startups are not born yet. You're only born when you find product market fit. Now, the question is how to know if your startup is a zombie. Zombie basically means that you're dead. It doesn't exist, really. You should close it. It's very tough. Just like I said in the beginning, it's very important to be persistent and to stay as much as possible with our startup. Also, at some point, it makes sense to stop and basically close your startup. Many, by the way, uh, successful startup founders are serial entrepreneurs. They had a few startups that they failed in, but they were smart spending years on something that doesn't work. Okay. So if your startup, usually what I would recommend is work at least 6 to 9 months on a startup. Okay. Give it the initial time. But if after this time you see that you're very far from product market fit, which means selling is incredibly difficult, and especially if you close it down today, nobody would really care. That's a very big sign that you have an issue in your startup. If there is no clear way of covering your costs and generating the revenue and investment that you need, it's another great sign that your startup might be a zombie. If people are not excited about it, And more than anything, if you are not excited about it, then maybe we have a few signs here that it's time to move on to the next thing. Every adventure is basically, again, what you learned in your first startup is really going to serve you to become a much better founder in your next startup. So that's something to think about. So yeah, I think we covered a few elements here. I hope it was useful for you, and we'll definitely stay in touch. We're gonna do more of those lectures. So thanks so much for arriving, and we'll be in touch. Stay tuned for more lectures. Thank you so much. Have a good one.